What's up, you guys? I'm Risha Marie, and thank you so much for clicking on this video today. So in today's video, I'm going to be focusing on another true crime. So if you did check out my last video, and by the way, thanks so much for all the love that I got on that video. I covered Kenneka Jenkins' story. So you guys make sure you check that video out if you haven't already. Check it out after this one. And in today's video, we're going to cover someone that I didn't know much about, but he is a very notorious person in history, and that is Jim Jones. Now, I'm not talking about the rapper Jim Jones, no. This Jim Jones was a famous, or a well-known, shall I say, church leader, cult leader, however you want to refer to him as. And the only thing I really knew about him was like bits and pieces. Like I knew like the big thing, but I never really knew much about the history behind him. Like I said, he was a church leader. The only thing I heard like that's synonymous kind of with his name is the whole phrase or pun, "Don't drink the Kool-Aid." But yeah, so I was like, let's look into his story a little bit more because it's extensive. I'm looking into these cases and different stories and different history because one, there are things I'm truly interested in. And then two, I think that taking a look at the past or things that have happened can make us more vigilant in the future. So, without further ado, now you guys, before we jump into this video, make sure you are subscribed. Make sure you thumbs up this video. Make sure your notification bell is on. And down below in the comments, let me know what you think. And also let me know some other stories or true crime cases that you want me to look into. So I do have a video that I want us to watch together and react to that talks about the actual Jim Jones massacre that happened in 1978. But first, I wanted to give a little backstory because I don't know if you guys are like me and you just know like what happened, but let's take a look at Jim Jones, the person. Jim Jones was born in Indiana. He was born and raised in Indiana. Jim Jones described himself as a kid that was kind of like an eyeball out, really didn't fit in with the other kids, really didn't grow close bonds with friends per se. But when it came to grabbing attention or leading, that's where he excelled at. Getting the kids to follow along with him, getting everybody's attention. In fact, one of his girlfriends from high school said that he performed this weird funeral type ritual for one of the games at school, a funeral for the opposing team, and he captivated the entire school. Jim Jones' parents weren't super religious individuals, but as Jim Jones got older, he began to search out different churches. He went to multiple different churches time and time again. He would stay for a little bit, kind of catch a vibe for the church somewhat, but then eventually grow bored with it and switch over to the next church. And he did this repeatedly for most of his teenage, early 20s life. And then he realized that, you know, preaching was his passion. So obviously, in Jim Jones fashion, he couldn't just be a member of the church. He had to lead the church. Jones founded People's Temple in 1950 in Indiana. And it began to pick up a lot of members because the things that he was preaching about was things that a lot of people related to and they thought would actually help make society better. Jim Jones preached about social equality, racial injustice, communities, family life, and tolerance. With the things that he was preaching, it drew in a large crowd. Majority of those being African American members. Jim Jones did a lot of charity works with his church. He reached out and helped with political campaigns. He did charities for the needy within his church. As time grew and he began to expand, he moved his church to California in the 60s. His church was ever growing and his following continued to follow him no matter where he went. So in California in the 60s, Jim Jones started to begin to get a bad rap for himself. Instead of, you know, this guy that was for the people and bringing about equality, he started getting bad media press and negative attention. So his great idea was to move his church to Guyana because in his mind, the government was trying to control him and stop him from bringing peace and turn his followers against him. The media began to make claims of abuse and control that was going on from the hands of Jones. Around the 70s is when Jones made the decision to move his church to Guyana, and where he promised his followers that this would be their modern day paradise. You wouldn't have the constriction of the government trying to tear them down and trying to pull them apart. So he wanted to move his church and his following to Guyana. And now you would think, that's a long way to go. First they followed you from Indiana to California. Now they're going to follow you to Guyana? I don't know. But almost 1,000 individuals followed him to Guyana for this church. Now, looking at the church, you would think that, everybody had their own housing and all this type of individuals. But they all seemed to live within the church. It was kind of like their own community within the church, and no one really left those walls. And like I mentioned, as time went on, his message seemed to change. It went from one of community and tolerance and social justice to one of more so personal loyalty and obedience to him. So things began to change quite a bit. Now, I do have this video that kind of talks about what life was like in Guyana and the actual day that this event took place. So let's take a look at it, y'all. Let's dissect this together, okay?
Chances are you've heard the saying, "Don't drink the Kool-Aid."
Super cake!
It refers to Jim Jones, a cult leader who gave his followers cyanide-laced punch, resulting in the mass murder-suicide of more than 900 people. But why would so many follow him to their deaths? Well, today we're going to take a look at what life was like in the People's Temple cult before the Jonestown massacre killed over 900 people. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other infamous historical stories you would like to hear about. Okay, let's all remember to watch, but not drink, the Kool-Aid.
I'm not going to pause this video too much because I hate watching reactions where they do that, but he's making too light of this situation. Like, I know that's a famous punchline, like, don't drink the Kool-Aid, but I don't know. It's a little too cynical for my humor.
Whoever coined the expression, women and children first, was definitely not thinking about Jonestown. But nonetheless, Jones and his loyalists served cyanide-laced flavor aid to Jonestown's youth before anyone else. Some adults even orally administered cyanide-filled syringes to children. According to a survivor, many adults lost their will to live after this incident. Tracy Parks, a survivor who was just 12 years old at the time, claimed there was child labor at Jonestown. After Jones's gunmen shot Parks's mother, she and her sister hid in the jungles of Guyana, while the rest of Jones's followers drank the poison. Jonestown ultimately claimed the lives of 909 people, a third of whom were children. In 2008, CNN learned Jones had started ordering and receiving shipments of cyanide in 1976, 2 years before that fateful day. These shipments are strong evidence that he had been planning that day for years. In fact, it's especially macabre given that the majority of Jonestown residents had yet to move to Guyana in 1976. That is, he was still bringing in new followers knowing what he was planning. To legally buy cyanide, Jones secured a jeweler's license, as jewelers could use cyanide to clean gold. Then, he started experimenting. 6 months before, Jonestown's doctor wrote the following to Jones. Cyanide is one of the most rapidly acting poisons. I would like to give about 2 grams to a large pig to see how effective our batch is. The infamous day ultimately took place on November 18, 1978. But Jones held rehearsals first. Known as White Nights, Jones would shout through the loudspeakers that surrounded the Jonestown complex. White night, get to the pavilion, run, your lives are in danger. Jones heightened his followers' sense of danger by telling them how outsiders were coming to take them out. Even worse, Jones had armed people waiting in the jungle. To the followers, these rehearsals seemed far too real. However, it turned out the guns were firing rubber bullets, and it was all a ruse to terrify the people who lived at Jonestown. Next, Jones brought out supposedly poisoned flavor aid for his followers to drink. No one perished during White Nights as the drinks were safe to consume. After the drill, Jones returned to the loudspeakers, saying, Now I know I can trust you. Go home, my darlings. Sleep tight. Though the People's Temple preached abstinence from drugs, Jim Jones himself reportedly disregarded this tenet and freely abused them. Terry Buford O'Shea, a survivor of the Jonestown compound, believed those illegal narcotics may have even contributed to Jones's mental demise. O'Shea later discovered that Jones was using to manipulate his followers. According to her, Jones's followers didn't know he was an addict. She claimed that substances were anathema at the temple, and residents weren't supposed to use them. She said after the fact, she learned that Jones had been drugging some people to keep them from trying to leave, to keep them from trying to dissent, and to control them in different ways, all unbeknownst to the masses. It was after the arrival of U.S. Representative Leo Ryan in Guyana that reportedly instigated the terrible day of Jonestown residents.
Inquire into the health and the welfare of American citizens who are here.
Ryan, then the state representative of California, had received complaints about the settlement. Family members of Jonestown residents and some of the cult's defectors had notified authorities of the happenings at Jonestown. One of those defectors was Deborah Layton, the sister of one of Jones's most trusted cronies. Layton snuck away from the compound in Guyana and went to the embassy to tell officials what she knew. After listening to many concerns and stories, Ryan and 23 others boarded a plane to the small South American country. Among them was Jackie Speer, who was then Ryan's legislative counsel, and later became a state representative of California. Speer said that after waiting 2 days for Jones to let them into the compound, they interviewed Jonestown residents and witnessed seemingly normal behavior. However, a resident passed a note to Don Harris, a reporter for NBC News who had accompanied the congressman, saying that the residents wanted to leave. According to Speer, more and more people wanted to leave,
And see, it's easy to look at stuff like this and be like, you should have never went, or like just get out. But this man had gained mind control over these people. Like, imagine like some of the followers that he had was the same followers that had been with him from the beginning, when he was teaching about social injustice and all that kind of stuff, and racial equality and all that. They were looking at him like, we've been following you since the 50s. That's 30 years of following someone, and you probably think, oh, well, maybe he's just a little paranoid right now. It's almost like when you know somebody so long, when they start changing who they are or appearing different from what you remember of them, you try to hold on to what you remember of them instead of actually accepting what they're presenting to you. And I mean, it's hard to do that. It's hard to let go of what you remembered of somebody. But oftentimes, when people start to change, so to speak, or show you a different face, it's who they were in the whole time. They don't just magically change into a different person. Now, with him, it wasn't helping that he was on drugs, because that altered his mental. And then the fact that he was getting so many following. Like, he had over 1,000 people follow him to Guyana. Like, that many people following one man, that type of things, like messing with your ego. Then he was getting paranoid. He kept moving because he thought people was after him. I don't know. They should have came with more than just some congressmen. Went with a whole army.
It became clear that one plane wasn't going to be enough. The congressman decided he was going to stay behind and take the next airlift out. It was so emotionally raw. Sadly, the reports of Jones stockpiling weapons turned out to be accurate. After U.S. Representative Leo Ryan and his group attempted to remove people from the Jonestown compound, Jim Jones sent gunmen on a tractor trailer to stop them. They opened fire on Ryan, a few journalists, and cult members, with 10 others shot and assumed dead. Earlier that day, 11 people left Jonestown in the morning. They had no idea of the horror to come. According to escapee Leslie Wilson, it was a slave camp run by a madman. Though they had come to Jonestown expecting an egalitarian paradise, the reality was dramatically different. Wilson called their 30-mile trek to another town a walk of freedom. Jones wasn't just violent with outsiders. Survivor Loa Johnson Cole said that Jones once pointed a pistol at her while she fell asleep in a meeting. Terry Buford O'Shea remembers Jones holding a gun at her. O'Shea recalled that Jones also beat people for a range of infractions, which varied in severity. The worst beating she witnessed was when somebody was accused of being abusive towards children. Jones took hold of a rubber hose and proceeded, in front of others, to beat this man's privates. Hey, Weird History, we've got a message about CuriosityStream. From award-winning exclusive...
That's an odd place to put your sponsor or plug your show, whatever that is. That's very odd. But dang, this man sounds like a slave owner. Like, honestly, like, he keeps y'all in this, I don't know, box. This, like, temple, quote unquote. You can't leave. He got gunmen hanging outside of the skirt, so if you try to leave, you getting shot. He pulling guns on you if he don't like something you do. He beating people. Like, what in the slavery? Honestly, like, and the crazy thing is, people flocked to him because during that time, like in the 50s, you know, racism was still alive and well. And he was teaching these things like, oh, we can all be together, kumbaya. And he's sitting over there treating y'all like modern day slaves. Like, what in the world? Now, we're going to skip this little curiosity thing because I'm not finished. $14.99? Come on now.
Himself as a Jesus-like character, Jones frequently healed people at his services, and even claimed he could cure cancer. He also alleged he was a psychic who could see events that had yet to unfold. Laura Johnson Cole said that while she believed in Jones and his healings at the time, she later learned the truth. It turned out Jones had staged his antics, and cult members had helped set up Jones's psychic moments. Though these allegations remain unproven, Jones and his followers may be responsible.
Bro, it's just like that, who's that dude that be on late night on, like, BET, with the holy water, like, sprinkle some of this on your coin purse, and you gonna come into $1 million. That's, bruh, that's exactly what that sounds like.
May be responsible for more deaths than the ones in Guyana. In fact, some believe the People's Temple were behind as many as 8 prior to their relocation to South America. In one such instance, a follower named Truth Heart had purportedly perished from congestive heart failure. But later investigators have suggested that her cause may not have been so clear-cut. Some temple members have claimed that Jones facilitated her demise after she started to disagree with him and expressed her desire to leave the cult. Supposedly, Jones ordered a People's Temple nurse to give Hart something that could induce a heart attack. Jones then predicted Hart's heart attack as a show of his clairvoyant powers. In 2003, Dr. Philip G. Zimbardo, a psychology professor at Stanford University, theorized that Jones might have learned some of his control techniques from George Orwell's novel 1984. In fact, in his 25 years of research and extensive interviews with Jonestown survivors, Zimbardo found several remarkable similarities between Jones's methods and those portrayed in the famous novel. For example, Orwell's idea of Big Brother may have existed in Jonestown, as Jim Jones made cult members spy on each other and used loudspeakers throughout the compound to continually broadcast his voice. Jones also forced his followers to give him information that he could later use against them, which is similar to what happened to the main character in 1984. Also, many who read 1984 remember Newspeak, the propaganda language used in the novel's fictional dystopia of Oceania. Well, Jones adopted an analogous measure by making his followers thank him for food and work. According to Zimbardo's research, Jones even commissioned a song that his followers were required to sing at Jonestown about the advent of the year 1984. Jeff Ginn, an investigative journalist and author of the book The Road to Jonestown, Jim Jones and the People's Temple, said in an interview, "If Jim Jones had been hit by a car and killed somewhere toward the end of the 1950s, he'd be remembered today as one of the great leaders in the early civil rights movement." Jones's charisma, along with his convincing blend of Christian and Marxist beliefs, attracted many people to the People's Temple. The vast majority of his followers were African American, as Jones claimed to be advancing racial equality. In addition, the church had connection with the Nation of Islam and the Black Panthers, and Jones worked to end segregation in places such as restaurants and movie theaters. Jones also adopted and raised children from diverse backgrounds. Jones initially pitched the vision of Jonestown as a paradise, free from the inequality present in the United States. However, this was not the reality at Jonestown, and just like his psychic powers, his belief in civil rights may have never been anything more than a ruse. The choice to settle the People's Temple in Guyana was intentional. Jones needed an English-speaking country with a large black population and a socialist government. Aside from Guyana, Jones's only other option was Grenada. However, another party ultimately outbid the People's Temple for the plot of land in Grenada. So Guyana it was. And Guyana benefited from the deal with Jim Jones. The land the People's Temple used was previously an area that prompted a conflict with Venezuela. The Jonestown settlement gave Guyana an advantage when it came to potential future conflicts with Venezuela. If Venezuela decided to come after the land again, they would have to deal with nearly 1,000 American citizens. After Jonestown, the remains were transported back to the United States, but some were unable to be claimed by relatives. Many people at Jonestown had changed their names, and though some had records of their real identities, not all did. Some took on the last name Jones to show their loyalty to Jim Jones, while others assumed traditional African names. This was a popular practice among African Americans at the time, independent of Jonestown, and the primary reason why many of the Jonestown victims went unidentified. Others changed their names to support the ideologies of Che Guevara and Lenin, the former leader of the Soviet Union. Allegedly, Jim Jones outlawed the name Linda after a woman with the same name defected and left the cult. However, it's unclear who, if anyone, changed her name because of this decree. So what do you think? Why do you think so many people followed Jim Jones? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at
Alright, y'all. So I find it very interesting that majority of his following was African Americans, because typically when you're trying to gain control, some type of control, you go after the socially oppressed or those who are looking for a way out, those who are who appear easily manipulated. At the time, who had it the worst? I mean, even if we look at today, who has it the worst socially, economically, like on earth? African Americans. Like, people of color are the most oppressed. So you go after those, you throw out these speeches of freedom and social equality and paradise-like life if you follow me. And when you think that there's no other way, or this is something that's, or not even when you think there's no other way, when this sounds like something that's so intriguing compared to what you've already been heard about segregation and keeping apart and all these other things, when you have somebody preaching that, hey, I'm going to make us all equal, I'm going to have us all in union, like, of course you're going to go there. And then, I mean, just constantly moving like, oh, we have to get away from these people. It just becoming more and more paranoid as time progressed. I don't know. And, even looking at his story, a lot of people, when they think back to that day, they call it mass murder, mass suicide. Like, they lump the two together. But I honestly can get why they put the two together, because I do believe it was some people that followed this man so much, was so dedicated to him, that they willingly drank it, because they're like, it's no better way, you're right. Because he was preaching like, if we don't drink this, if you don't do this, they're gonna get us, or all this other paranoia. But I think for the mass majority that was there, that was a murder, because they couldn't leave. Like, they talked about in the video, it talked about how he had armed gunmen surrounding the plantation. That's what we're gonna call it. He had mass gunmen surrounding the plantation, and if they tried to leave, they were gonna get gunned down. So it's either I take my life, or you're gonna take it. It's like either. And then think about the people with children, because a third of the people that died that day were children. Imagine looking at your baby and saying, like, I'm sorry I put you in these circumstances. I'm sorry I subjected you to this life. I thought it was better here. And then syringing your child this poison, because I'd rather put you to sleep myself than let somebody else kill you. That is insane. That is insane. That is insane. 900 plus people died that day. And then they said that Jim Jones, he was a part of the people that died, but he died via a gunshot. And it was like, we don't know if he did it himself or somebody else shot. He didn't do it himself. Ain't no way. Somebody else had to shoot him. I don't understand. I mean, he could have been that high off life that he was just like, oh, we all gotta die, we all gotta go out of here. But Imagine believing in a human being that much. That is scary. That you will follow this man to the ends of the earth, and then once you get there, you can't get out. I mean, even part of me starts to think that the following that he had, following him from state to state beforehand, before they even moved to Guyana, that they were being forced too. I don't know if he was keeping up this fake, all his love personality before he moved to Guyana, but goodness gracious. And then adopting all these multi-race kids to make it look like, oh, I'm a man of the people, like I don't see, oh goodness, get out of here. Get out of here. But I'm not going to keep y'all too long. Y'all let me know down in the comments. What's your thoughts on Jim Jones? Do you think that day in 1978 was a mass murder or a mass suicide? Or do you think it's a conjunction of both? What do you think about him as a whole? Do you think that he was always this evil individual that set out to kill people? Or do you really think paranoia set in and he really thought this was the best way of life for them to end it? Or was it just all just control and manipulation? What's your thoughts? Make sure you guys let me know down in the comments. And then also let me know for next week who you want me to look into if you have any ideas. And I'll hit y'all back with another video. Peace.